cryptocurrency world has witnessed a significant courtroom drama. FTX's founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, convicted on all charges following the collapse of FTX. This segment delves into the events leading up to this pivotal moment.
Sam Bankman-Fried has been found guilty on all 7 criminal counts against him. Former federal prosecutor Paul Tuchman weighs in on the verdict reached after just 3 hours of deliberations. And James Katoulis, a trial attorney and crypto trader, discusses the impact of the verdict on the industry.
Like I was saying, it's FTX. It's a safe and easy way to get into crypto.
I don't think so. And I'm never wrong about this stuff. Never.
After just 3 hours of deliberations, the jury notified the court that it had reached a verdict. A few minutes later, all counts had been read. The 31-year-old son of 2 Stanford legal scholars was convicted of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and 5 other charges, all tied to the collapse late last year of FTX and its sister hedge fund Alameda. Now, this trial, which kicked off in early October, pitted the testimony of SBF's inner circle against the sworn statements of their former boss and roommate. The verdict was announced exactly 1 year to the day since CoinDesk published an article revealing a close relationship between FTX and Alameda based on a balance sheet reviewed by the crypto news outlet. Now, just 9 days after that article was published, FTX filed for bankruptcy and SBF stepped down as CEO. The MIT graduate remained stoic and didn't show emotion when the verdict was read in court. His father slumped over as each guilty verdict came in. His mother was visibly emotional.
FTX's bankruptcy, initiated in November 2022, was triggered by a sudden surge in withdrawals, revealing an $8 billion deficit in FTX's accounts. Before its downfall, FTX stood as the 3rd largest cryptocurrency exchange by volume, boasting over 1 million users. In November 2022, revelations surfaced that Alameda Research, a trading firm affiliated with FTX and spearheaded by Bankman-Fried, held a significant portion of FTX's exchange token, FTT. This disclosure led to a spike in FTX withdrawals, eventually leaving customers unable to access their funds. FTX's collapse sent shockwaves throughout the cryptocurrency industry. Federal prosecutors dubbed it one of the most significant financial frauds in American history, drawing parallels with past financial scandals. Following the bankruptcy, the Securities Commission of the Bahamas seized the assets of an FTX subsidiary.
Sam Bankman-Fried perpetrated one of the biggest financial frauds in American history, a multi-billion-dollar scheme designed to make him the king of crypto. But here's the thing. The cryptocurrency industry might be new. The players like Sam Bankman-Fried might be new. But this kind of fraud, this kind of corruption is as old as time, and we have no patience for it.
In a statement, Attorney General Merrick Garland said that, quote, "This case should send a clear message to anyone who tries to hide their crimes behind a shiny new thing they claim no one else is smart enough to understand. The Justice Department will hold you accountable." As for the defense, we heard from SBF's attorney Mark Cohen last night.
We respect the jury's decision, but we're very disappointed in the result. My client, Mr. Bankman-Fried, maintains his innocence, and we're going to continue to vigorously fight the charges against him.
Okay, so what happens next? Post-trial motions for the defense are due in about 2 weeks. The FTX founder faces a maximum sentence of 115 years in prison. His sentencing is scheduled for March 28th. The government has until February 1st to let the court know if prosecutors plan to proceed with a totally separate second trial that SBF is facing on March 11th, related to alleged campaign finance violations.
Financial ramifications were felt far and wide. Bankman-Fried's net worth, once estimated at $16 billion, plummeted. Several institutional FTX investors wrote off their stakes, and an unauthorized transaction saw $473 million withdrawn from FTX. The fallout saw Bitcoin prices drop to a two-year low. Late 2022 and early 2023 witnessed key FTX and Alameda executives, including Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh, pleading guilty to defrauding FTX customers. The climax came on 2 November 2023 when Sam Bankman-Fried was found guilty on these charges, among others.
So, for our main story, I spoke with former federal prosecutor Paul Tuchman about what's next. Tuchman, who's provided legal context here on Crypto World throughout the SBF trial, also weighs in on the swift verdict. I want to start by getting your reaction to just the speed of the verdict here. It took about 3 hours for the jury to reach a decision on all 7 counts. What's your reaction to just how quickly they found him guilty, and how common is that?
For a trial of this length, it's not common at all. It really goes to show just the strength of the government's case, and ultimately the fact that the jury, really all 12 of them, came to the conclusion quite quickly that what the government was telling them was in fact the case through the government's witnesses, and that the defense case, which was in large part, of course, SBF's testimony itself, was unpersuasive.
Now, ultimately, this trial really did come down to the mountain of evidence that Sam Bankman-Fried himself put out into the world. So the tweets, the speaking to journalists. It seems like this was a pretty easy case for prosecutors. What's your take on that?
Well, no case of this complexity I would ever call easy. But a lot of times, when you have a trial like this, the hardest work is done not during the trial, but in preparation for the trial. The prosecutor did lots of hard work to prepare their witnesses, to get the 3 cooperating witnesses to come forward and to effectively be able to use them. And so there's a whole lot of work that goes into a prosecution like this before you even show up in the courtroom. And so while they certainly did have a mountain of evidence, it was a lot of work that they had to get that way.
Now, the defense does have the right to appeal. They'll be deciding on that in the coming weeks. I want to talk about sentencing, though. That's coming up in
Certainly.
March. Do you expect a full 115 years, as is the maximum for these crimes? Or are you looking at a more truncated sentence? Elizabeth Holmes recently, for example, was sentenced to 11 years.
I certainly would expect a sentence at least of 11 years in this case. So the amount of losses that were suffered is simply staggering. And really, Elizabeth Holmes is a better example of someone who of such a relatively young age to be convicted of a crime like this. I think another example would be Bernie Madoff, right, who was convicted of causing such significant investor losses. And like Madoff, a lot of the losses in this case were small investors. They weren't all large institutions, which really tends to create a greater pressure for a significant sentence. So I certainly don't think that we would see anything lower than 11 years, but Judge Kaplan has a lot of discretion in the sentence that he imposes, and we'll see that. I think another important question is, with respect to sentencing, what's the government's position going to be? Certainly, I would expect they will ask for a sentence far, far longer than 11 years. One potential wild card, though, is you mentioned the possibility of an appeal, which is that I don't know if it would be effective, but SBF and his attorneys, they might try and propose to the prosecution that if he agrees to plead guilty to the remaining charges that he faces, the ones relating to campaign finance offenses and bribing a Chinese government official, and he agrees not to appeal this conviction, that perhaps they'll agree not to seek as significant a sentence.
Now, do you think that his decision to testify will potentially worsen his sentencing?
That's quite likely. It's very common when a defendant testifies and is then convicted that if the sentencing judge believes that the witness has lied on the stand, that they will give them a harsher sentence. And in this case, certainly during the comments that he made during the course of SBF's testimony, he certainly indicated a fair amount of frustration, the judge did, with some of the answers that SBF gave. Now, on the other hand, so a lot of the things that Judge Kaplan did indicated that he was already very unfavorably disposed towards SBF. So it's possible that the testimony that he gave won't make it worse because it was already going to be very, very bad.
Now, the other thing to note here is that SBF isn't totally done with trials. There's still the potential that he could face another separate trial with a different set of charges in March, some related to campaign finance related allegations. What are the chances that prosecutors go through with this? The judge gave them a deadline of February 1st to say whether or not they still wanted to bring that case. But I mean, for example, if he's sentenced to what amounts to life in prison, is there even a point in bringing that second case?
Well, that goes to the point that I mentioned before, which is the agreement not to appeal this conviction. Certainly, I think that SBF has a very uphill battle if he was going to appeal this conviction here for a lot of reasons. However, from the prosecution's perspective, you never want to take anything for granted. And so until this conviction is affirmed on appeal, I think they have to treat his upcoming cases as if they might be their only opportunity to hold him account ultimately for any misconduct. So I certainly believe that unless that they can reach some kind of a deal with SBF that would involve him not appealing this sentence, that they are likely to go forward. Now, I certainly haven't talked to them, so I don't know that. But if I were in their position, I would want to go forward. And in effect, for them, well, it's more work. It's almost like playing with house money, right? Because you could go forward with the trial, and even if it's difficult, and even if you lose, you've still got in your back pocket, although it's subject to appeal, the convictions that you've already gotten on these charges that we got the verdict for yesterday.
All right, so I also spoke with trial attorney and crypto trader James Katulis today about what this verdict means for the digital asset industry as a whole.
MSNBC senior business analyst, and she joins me now. I gotta say, for a relatively complicated fraud, white collar case where you're looking at numbers and books, 4.5 hours on every count is wow.
This is stunning that it was so quick, and it speaks to the fact that the government rolled up. They took his closest confidants, his ex-girlfriend who worked for him, the top lieutenants in his company. They all cooperated with the government, and they turned on him. And what was stunning was in the last week that Sam Bankman-Fried, who, is not necessarily the best communicator, doesn't present well, chose to take the stand. And what did the prosecution do? Hit him right between the eyes and showed up with receipts. They used his own words and his own lieutenant's proof and said, no, sir, this is what you did. And that's sort of what people are saying. Right. This almost has the ghosts of Trump. Right? When you think about all the people that the government is rolling up against Trump right now, and could they turn to him and say, no, sir, these are your words. Right. These are the documents. And so the prosecution showed up with the receipts, and boom, in 4 hours, guilty on everything. That's stunning.
Yeah, and I think part of it, there's two things here, right? One is the hubris of testifying for yourself, which usually you don't do that, but this sort of idea of I can talk my way out of this, which I think...
But that's how he's always seen himself.
Yes, and he's even through this whole thing, he's been talking to reporters, he's been giving interviews, bro, don't...
Okay, during this, he was taking phone calls from me months and months ago, right? I obviously wanted an interview. I would talk to this man on the phone thinking, I can't believe this. Right. But he has always felt like this business, this corporate world, I know better, which is the same thing he felt about politics and every other vertical. He viewed people over the age of 40, you and me, useless.
Well, I imagine there were some on the jury. Part of the thing, too, about this case, as surprising as it is for a sort of complex case like this, again, it's not that complex, but to come down so quickly, is that the core of the crime was not complex, right?
Okay, you just hit everything. Because people from the outside are like, oh, crypto, I don't get it. No, this isn't about crypto. No. Right? It's about stealing. Yoink. It is about saying, uh-oh, I'm losing money over here. I got all these customer funds over here.
Got deposits.
Exactly. I'm going to move A and stick it over to B. Right?
Ding, ding, ding. You have just explained the crime.
Right? Sam Bankman-Fried, right there. Right? This isn't about how crypto works and the market went up and a margin call. Right.
Yes. If your banker... had a problem with sports gambling.
Yes.
And was out to the mob and then just decided, well, there's a few $1,000s sitting in your account. Maybe he could pay off the guy. Gambling banks, we all understand, absolutely can't do that. That's essentially the government's case against him.
I'm going to defend him for one moment. Yeah. One of the reasons he did believe his own hype is everyone else did.
Dude.
Okay? The biggest names in finance.
You remember that Super Bowl?
It was
It's the most insane thing I've ever seen.
It was the FTX Super Bowl. And I don't just mean Tom Brady and Giselle. Right. You had some of the biggest investors, the most sophisticated investors on Wall Street that could pay huge fees investing in this guy. right? Last year, it was just a year ago plus a few weeks. He spoke at a huge finance conference in New York. Everybody rolled up there wearing suits. That guy showed up in his Dungeons and Dragons look with the hair, and the place worshipped the ground he walked on. So he believed his own hype, but so did everyone else, and we shouldn't forget that.
In defense of the Dungeons and Dragons, look, I respect a man that shows up like that to the thing. But he is now, I mean, it's really wild. I mean, talk about whatever. It's a sort of almost a cliche to talk about a meteoric rise and fall, which is a thing that we do in our line of work. But wow, meteoric rise and fall. I mean, the guy went from some random trader that no one had heard of to one of the richest people in the world and maybe worth like $30 billion at his peak.
Correct.
To now looking at 100 years in federal prison. And that whole thing happened over the course of 4 or 5 years?
And thought he was going to change the world and change the world. The world operated, change politics.
He was intervening in Democratic primaries all over the place. He was giving Mitch McConnell money in secret.
But right there. So you're going to see in some media right now people saying, don't forget Sam Bankman-Fried, deeply tied to the Democratic Party. And Republicans.
Yes.
Right?
He was playing
You interviewed Michael Lewis, who just wrote a massive book on Sam Bankman-Fried a few weeks ago. And Michael Lewis was with Sam as Sam was headed to Washington for dinner with Mitch McConnell, according to Michael's book, where he was going to potentially help Mitch. According to Michael, he was discussing how much money would Sam have to pay Trump to not run again.
He had a scheme to pay.
I remember Michael wrote the book saying this is a letter to the jury. They'll decide. Well, guess what?
I don't know.
They decided.
I don't know if they read the book. Stephanie ruled.
But they decided.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, from a defense perspective, why do you think SBF went to trial instead of just pleading guilty or even trying to come to some sort of plea arrangement with the government? This turned into a pretty damning trial that exposed a lot of his personal and professional life. A plea would ostensibly have spared him from more jail time. What was the calculus here on the defense's side?
Well, so to get I think a true plea deal was very unlikely, given that they had already cut plea deals and he was the target, right? They did the Caroline plea deal, the Gary plea deal. So they wanted SBF. So they were unlikely to give him anything that would be meaningfully helpful. Like if you're a young guy and you're going to plead down to 50 years, right? Like you're still like 80 when you get out. So in that case, the risk versus reward is to go to trial and pray for a Hail Mary to be successful. But the defense put on by both SBF and his lawyers was, it's an embarrassment, but I mean, they were so plainly guilty that, there's not much you could do. But if you're SBF and you think, hey, look, I conned, the biggest VCs in the world out of billions of dollars in venture capital, I conned all these customers to give me billions of dollars that I just, stole to buy Bahamian real estate and, to pay my prop hedge funds trading losses, right? He probably thought, well, you know what, maybe I could con one juror into finding me, not guilty and that they'll hold out for me. So yeah, I think that was the risk versus reward calculus, but, they weren't able to pull it off because the evidence was just so damning.
There's been this narrative that crypto is really on trial here. The trial's done. What does it say about the crypto industry and specifically how we prosecute crypto-related crime? This was about fraud and money laundering, which can happen anywhere, but it probably won't be the last time that we see it happen in crypto. Prosecutors just brought similar charges against executives of SafeMoon. There's that Mashinsky trial coming up related to Celsius. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of bad actors in the crypto space, and a big reason for that is that the government, 13 years later, doesn't have a crypto statute. You've got an SEC that's operating under an unconstitutional regulation by enforcement regime where they're suing good actors like Coinbase, right, and letting frauds like SBF go. So in the absence of regulatory clarity and having statutes and a clear path where good actors can develop regulatorily sound, security tokens and things of that nature, you've basically given the industry to con men like SBF and have them operate offshore. I mean, most of FTX operations were in the Bahamas, and crypto's not illegal, right? So when you don't have any mechanism for consumers to access it in a safe, regulated manner, they're going to go offshore. So the SEC is a lot to blame in all of these frauds. And, just yesterday they came out, they issued a subpoena to PayPal over a stable coin. And it's like, hey, Gensler, a stable coin isn't a security. Okay, like you don't have jurisdiction. And I personally am currently suing the SEC and Catullus versus SEC because they try to subpoena me over a non-security crypto. So, when you've got the government completely out of control, they are aiding and abetting the criminals in the space.
So there have been lots of calls for new regulation after the fall of FTX, but now that the trial is done and we learned a lot more about just how Sam Bankman-Fried and his co-conspirators carried out their fraud through self-issued tokens and commingling, was there anything that stuck out to you from this case as being, most important from a regulatory perspective, something that needs to be addressed first?
Well, in some sense, a lot of their fraud they did is covered by existing laws, right? And the proof is in the pudding. They convicted them on all 7 charges. So you don't really need new laws when, for example, their paperwork said that customer assets and the broker are segregated. They clearly didn't segregate them. So that's fraud. Whether or not you've got a regulation or a regulator or not, when you put it in a contract saying we're going to segregate your assets, but you're actually stealing them, that's something that's covered already. Now, what regulators can do is monitor compliance with the laws before, things really got out of control. And I do think that is valuable. But right now you've got a regulatory regime in the U.S. that's just antagonistic to the entire industry. And that's not actually helpful. But, I would like to see crypto statutes get passed in the U.S. You've got draft bills at both houses, and you've seen every other major jurisdiction on earth has passed legislation. So the U.S. is way late to this party, and it's hurting the U.S. economy. It's probably done at least $500 billion worth of damage to the crypto ecosystem as a whole, not having this statutory clarity.
This case underscores the importance of vigilance, transparency, and regulatory compliance in the ever-evolving crypto landscape. For continued insights into the world of cryptocurrency and finance, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.